Have you ever worked with someone who had the exact same job title as you, but somehow acted like they were your manager every single day? That's exactly what happened to me. At first, I thought it was just an annoying personality trait. Then she started speaking for me in meetings, asking for updates on projects that weren't hers, and even correcting me in front of clients. The strangest part? Nobody had actually given her any authority. I kept wondering if I was overreacting, until one meeting changed everything and our real manager finally saw what had been happening for months. I never expected that simply doing my job well would slowly make me the least popular person on my team. When I started working as a project coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company, everything seemed perfectly normal. Our department wasn't particularly exciting. We managed shipments, coordinated with vendors, updated clients, and handled whatever unexpected problems appeared throughout the day. The team consisted of 6 people, all reporting to the same manager, Daniel. Nobody supervised anyone else. At least that was how it was supposed to work. For the first couple of months, everyone was friendly enough. We weren't close friends, but we'd chat during coffee breaks, complain about impossible deadlines, and help each other whenever someone got overwhelmed. Then Melissa joined. She transferred from another department after a restructuring, and everyone immediately treated her like she already knew everything. She certainly acted like she did. On her first week, she constantly mentioned how things had been done in her previous department. That's not how we handled it before. We had a better system. My old manager would have never approved this. I didn't think much of it. Every workplace has someone who compares everything to their previous job. The strange part started a few weeks later. Daniel assigned me to lead communication with one of our biggest clients because I'd built a good relationship with them. It wasn't a promotion. It didn't change my title. It just meant I became the primary contact for that account. The same afternoon, Melissa stopped by my desk. "So, are you planning to share your updates with me?" I looked up. "Why?" "So I can make sure nothing gets missed." I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. She didn't laugh back. "I think we're fine," I said. She smiled politely and walked away. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning. Almost every morning she'd ask me where I was with my tasks. "Did you send the revised pricing? Have you updated the shipment tracker? When are you planning to call the client?" She never asked because she was involved. She simply wanted to know. At first I answered because I assumed she was curious. Eventually I realized she was collecting information. During team meetings, she'd casually repeat everything I'd already done. "I believe Alex already contacted the client yesterday. I think Alex was planning to finish those reports this afternoon." She'd say it before I even had a chance to give my own update. Daniel never seemed to notice. He'd simply nod and continue the meeting. It felt like Melissa had somehow inserted herself between me and our actual manager. The weirdest part? She wasn't even trying to take credit for my work. She just wanted to control the conversation around it. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to another coworker. "I just like keeping everyone organized." Except nobody had asked her to. One Friday, I finished preparing a complicated shipment schedule for a customer that had already changed their delivery dates 3 times. It took nearly the entire day. 5 minutes after I emailed it directly to Daniel, I got a Teams message from Melissa. "Melissa, can you send me the file before you send it next time?" I replied, "Already sent." A minute later, another message appeared. I would have caught a formatting issue. There wasn't a formatting issue. Daniel approved it without changing a single line. I ignored the message. The following Monday, she walked over while I was updating inventory records. "You know," she said, pointing at my monitor, "I'd color code those cells differently. I prefer it this way. It'll confuse people." It hasn't so far. She stood there for another few seconds before walking away. I remember thinking how exhausting it was becoming. Not because she was creating extra work. Because every interaction felt like a tiny performance review that nobody had asked for. A couple of coworkers started noticing. One of them quietly asked me during lunch, "Why does Melissa always check on what you're doing?" "I honestly don't know. I thought she was training you at first." So did I. Except she wasn't. We had exactly the same job title. Exactly the same salary range. Exactly the same manager. Yet somehow she'd appointed herself as my unofficial supervisor. I kept telling myself it wasn't worth creating conflict. Maybe she'd eventually get bored. Maybe she'd move on to someone else. Instead, she became even more involved in work that had absolutely nothing to do with her. And that's when things started affecting more than just my patience. Things escalated so gradually that I didn't notice how much extra mental energy I was spending dealing with Melissa instead of my actual work. It wasn't the comments anymore. It was the interruptions. Every single day she'd stop by my desk 2 or 3 times with another suggestion. You should email them again. I'd probably word that differently. Have you thought about copying Daniel on that? Sometimes she'd even start giving advice before asking what I was working on. The strange thing was that she rarely talked about her own assignments. She always seemed to know what everyone else was doing, but somehow never looked particularly busy herself. One Tuesday morning, Daniel announced that our department would be responsible for preparing a proposal for a potential client worth several $1,000,000 a year. Everyone would have a different section. Mine involved coordinating shipping timelines and calculating operational costs. It was probably the most important project we'd worked on all year. As soon as the meeting ended, Melissa followed me out into the hallway. We should schedule regular check-ins. For what? For your section. My section. Yeah, it'll help keep everything consistent. I looked at her for a second. I think Daniel will let me know if he needs anything. Her smile disappeared for just a moment. I'm only trying to help. I appreciate it. It wasn't true anymore. I appreciated the first couple of suggestions months ago. Now it just felt like surveillance. Over the next week, she started messaging me several times a day. Any updates? How's your timeline coming? Can you send me your draft? At first I simply ignored the messages until the end of the day. Eventually I stopped answering altogether. Nothing happened. No deadlines were missed. Daniel never asked why Melissa wasn't receiving updates. Because of course she wasn't supposed to receive them in the first place. That realization made something click. The only person creating this imaginary reporting structure was Melissa herself. Nobody else was participating. Unfortunately, she didn't seem to notice. Instead, she doubled down. During another team meeting, Daniel asked everyone to give a brief progress update. Before I could speak, Melissa jumped in. Alex is about 80% finished. He's still waiting on revised freight estimates. The room went quiet. Daniel looked at me. Is that accurate? It was yesterday. Melissa turned toward me. So, what changed? I answered Daniel directly. I finished everything this morning after receiving the final numbers. He nodded. Perfect. Then he moved on. Nobody acknowledged how strange that exchange had been. But afterward, one of my coworkers walked beside me toward the break room. Dude. What? That was weird. I know. Why is she giving updates for your work? I wish I knew. I thought maybe Daniel asked her. He didn't. My coworker shook his head. I'd be losing my mind. Honestly, I already was. The constant second-guessing had started affecting how I worked. Before sending an email, I'd wonder whether Melissa would somehow find out and criticize it later. If I finished something early, I'd hesitate before telling anyone because she'd inevitably ask to review it. I caught myself changing perfectly good work simply because I could already imagine what she'd say. That bothered me more than anything. She wasn't actually supervising me, yet somehow I'd started acting like she was. A few days later, I arrived early to avoid distractions and finally had 2 uninterrupted hours to finish the proposal. Around 9 o'clock, Melissa walked in carrying coffee. She noticed me immediately. Oh good. I looked up. I wanted to catch you before you sent your section. I already did. Her expression froze. You already sent it? About 20 minutes ago. You should have let me review it first. I smiled politely. Daniel asked us to send everything directly to him. She stared at me. For a second I thought she'd argue. Instead she simply nodded. Okay. Then she walked away. That should have been the end of it. Instead, less than an hour later, Daniel called me into his office. For one brief moment I wondered if Melissa had somehow convinced him there was a problem. Instead he smiled. The proposal looks great. Thanks. One question. Sure. Has Melissa been helping you with this project? I paused. No. He looked mildly confused. Huh. Why? She mentioned she'd been overseeing everyone's progress. I almost laughed. Not mine. He leaned back in his chair but didn't say anything else. I left wondering if maybe, finally, he was beginning to notice what had been happening for months. I hoped that would solve everything. I was wrong. Because the following week Melissa crossed a line that made it impossible to ignore her behavior any longer. It happened in front of a client. And after that, staying quiet was no longer an option. The incident happened during a video call with one of our longest-standing clients. It was supposed to be routine. Daniel couldn't attend because he was in another meeting, so he asked me to walk the client through the updated implementation timeline. Melissa wasn't even invited. About 5 minutes before the meeting started, she walked into the conference room carrying her laptop. "Oh, you're joining?" I asked. I figured an extra set of ears couldn't hurt. It wasn't my meeting to police, so I didn't argue. The client joined exactly on time. Everything went smoothly for the first 15 minutes. We reviewed shipping milestones, warehouse capacity, and revised delivery windows. Then the client asked a question about one of the cost estimates. I opened my spreadsheet to explain how we calculated the numbers. Before I could answer, Melissa jumped in. "Alex is still reviewing that section." I turned toward her. "No, I'm not." She kept talking. "We're making a few internal adjustments before it's finalized." The client looked confused. "But I thought you sent us the final version yesterday." "I did," I replied. Melissa interrupted again. "There are always little improvements after the first draft." I could actually hear the hesitation in the client's voice. "So, should we ignore the version we received?" That was the moment I realized the conversation was becoming a problem. I smiled politely. "The document you received yesterday is the approved version. Nothing has changed." The client nodded, but the confidence that had been there at the beginning of the meeting was gone. We finished the call without any major issues, but I knew it hadn't gone as well as it should have. As soon as the meeting ended, Melissa looked at me. "I was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" If the client found an error later, they'd know we were still reviewing things. There wasn't an error. You never know. I took a slow breath. "Melissa." She waited. "I need you to stop speaking on my behalf during client meetings." Her face changed immediately. "I was helping." "I didn't ask for help." "You don't have to ask." "I actually do." For a few seconds neither of us said anything. Then she shrugged. "Fine." She picked up her laptop and left. It wasn't a dramatic argument. There was no yelling. But for the first time I had actually said what I'd been thinking for months. I expected things to get awkward. Instead they got quieter. She stopped coming to my desk. The team's messages disappeared. No more requests for updates. No more surprise reviews. For nearly a week, it felt like everything had gone back to normal. Then Daniel asked me to stop by his office. When I walked in, he closed the door behind me. "I wanted to ask you about something." "Sure." "I've noticed Melissa has been heavily involved in work that wasn't assigned to her." I stayed quiet. He continued. "At first I thought you two were just collaborating." "We weren't. I've started hearing similar comments from other people." That surprised me. "Other people?" He nodded. "Apparently you're not the only one she's been trying to manage." Suddenly months of confusing interactions made sense. It hadn't been personal. She'd been doing it to almost everyone. Daniel sighed. "I should have noticed sooner." "It's okay." "No, it's really not." He looked genuinely frustrated. "I've unintentionally allowed people to think she had authority she doesn't actually have." He paused. "I'm going to address it." I wasn't sure what that meant, and honestly I didn't ask. It wasn't my responsibility to decide how he handled his team. 2 days later we had our weekly department meeting. Everything felt normal until the very end. Daniel looked around the room. "Before we finish, I want to clarify something." Everyone looked up. "I've noticed some confusion regarding project responsibilities." The room became completely silent. Going forward, project updates should only come from the person assigned to the work. He looked around the table. If I need someone to review another employee's work, I'll assign that responsibility directly. Another pause. Otherwise, everyone here is an equal member of this team. Nobody said a word. Daniel wasn't looking at anyone in particular. He didn't mention Melissa by name. He didn't have to. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her staring down at her notebook. The meeting ended less than a minute later. As everyone stood up, one of my coworkers quietly whispered, "I think that speech was overdue." I couldn't help smiling. For the first time in months, I felt like I could simply do my job again. I honestly believed the situation was finally over. But the biggest surprise came a few weeks later, when Daniel called me into his office one more time. And this conversation changed the way I looked at Melissa completely. A few weeks passed, and the atmosphere in the office slowly returned to what it had been before Melissa arrived. People focused on their own work. Meetings became shorter. Clients stopped receiving mixed messages. Most importantly, I stopped wondering whether every email I sent would somehow be questioned 5 minutes later. Melissa became noticeably quieter. She still participated in discussions, but she no longer inserted herself into everyone else's projects. I assumed Daniel had spoken with her privately after the team meeting. Whatever was said seemed to have worked. Then one Friday afternoon, Daniel asked if I had a few minutes. I figured he wanted to discuss another project. Instead, he closed the office door and leaned back in his chair. "I owe you an apology." I looked at him confused. "For what? I should have stepped in months ago." I shrugged. "It worked out." "It did eventually." He sighed. "But managers aren't supposed to solve problems eventually." That sentence stuck with me. He continued. "When Melissa transferred here, her previous manager described her as someone with strong leadership instincts. I can see why. The problem is that nobody explained the rest." "What do you mean?" Daniel opened a notebook on his desk. "I spoke with her former manager after everything happened. Apparently, Melissa had behaved almost exactly the same way in her old department. She constantly checked on coworkers, inserted herself into projects, acted as though she were responsible for everyone else's work. According to her previous manager, she genuinely believed she was helping. She wasn't trying to steal credit. She wasn't trying to undermine people. She simply thought that keeping track of everyone made the team stronger. The issue," Daniel said, "is that nobody ever told her she was crossing boundaries. They just let it happen." He nodded. "People complained privately, but nobody addressed it directly. So she assumed everyone appreciated it." Exactly. Suddenly, months of frustration looked a little different. It didn't excuse her behavior, but it explained it. Daniel continued. "When I spoke with her, she seemed honestly surprised." Surprised. She said she thought everyone relied on her. I couldn't imagine believing that. Then again, if nobody ever corrected her, maybe it made sense. A few days later, something happened that I never expected. I was making coffee before lunch when Melissa walked into the break room. Normally we'd exchange a quick hello and move on. Instead, she stopped beside me. "Do you have a minute?" "Sure." She looked unusually nervous. I wanted to apologize. I didn't interrupt. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened." She stared at the floor for a second before continuing. "I honestly thought I was helping people stay organized." I nodded. "I know it probably didn't feel that way." It didn't. "I understand that now." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she laughed awkwardly. "My previous manager always told me I had leadership potential." I guess I took that a little too literally. That was probably the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. I should have stayed in my own lane. I smiled. "Probably." She laughed again. "I wasn't trying to make your life difficult." I know. That wasn't entirely true. For months I had assumed she was intentionally trying to control me. Now I wasn't so sure. She had definitely crossed professional boundaries. But looking back, I couldn't remember a single time she'd actually taken credit for my work. She hadn't tried to make me look bad. She hadn't lied about me. She'd simply convinced herself that supervising people was part of her job. It wasn't. But there was a difference. Over the next couple of months, things changed more than I expected. Melissa became one of the most reliable teammates in the department. She still had plenty of ideas, The difference was that she'd ask first, "Would you like another opinion? If not, no worries." Sometimes I accepted. Sometimes I didn't. Either way, she respected the answer. Daniel eventually introduced a clearer process for project ownership so there would never be confusion again. Every assignment listed exactly who was responsible, who approved the work, and who needed to be informed. The change helped everyone, not just us. Looking back, I realized the biggest problem had never been Melissa alone. It was the lack of clear boundaries. When expectations aren't communicated, people start creating their own versions of reality. Some employees become afraid to speak up. Others unintentionally take on authority they don't actually have. Neither situation is healthy. About 6 months later, our department held its annual performance reviews. When my meeting ended, Daniel smiled. "I've noticed something." "What's that?" "You seem a lot more relaxed." I laughed. "I probably am." "You've had one of the strongest years on the team." "Thanks. And I appreciate how professionally you handled everything." I wasn't always sure I was handling it well. Most people would have turned it into office drama. I didn't want that. I know. As I walked back to my desk, I realized something I hadn't thought about in a long time. For months, I'd been coming to work expecting another unnecessary confrontation. Now the loudest sound in the office was people typing on their keyboards. No one was asking for progress updates they weren't entitled to. No one was reviewing work they hadn't been assigned. Everyone was simply doing the job they had actually been hired to do. And honestly, that was all I'd wanted from the very beginning.